Yeah, first of all, welcome, Max. Thank you very much for coming joining us this evening. It's really exciting to hear from someone who's actually a living and breathing regular watch designer. So I think we'll start with the obvious place, which is how you got into design and watch design.
Sure. And I think, firstly, thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to talk with you about watch design. It's an interesting one for me because I never expected to design watches. I always had a passion for them, particularly through my grandfather. He loved watches and was always showing me what he'd be wearing. But my passion was always cars growing up. So I always wanted to be a car designer, as many people do when they're young. And I went to university to study car design. But while I was there, I started freelancing, as many young
Mhm.
designers will take up as they get started. And I started doing some personal projects around watch design and just concepts, things like that. And a studio in Switzerland happened to see my work and invited me out for an interview. Uh, Passed the interview and ended up working
Mhm.
there for a little over a year,
Oh, right.
and
Cool.
then came back to the UK to do a master's, but carried on freelance for the studio.
Mhm.
And it just spiraled from there into working freelance for across a range of brands in Switzerland, and then in time outside of Switzerland too, back in the UK and elsewhere.
And was that studio specifically watches?
Yeah, so that there's still a few around, but when I was there was quite a number of studios supporting the Swiss watch industry, and they were specialist design studios for the watch industry and watches, jewelry, and associated branding, retail displays, shops, various sort of
Mhm.
adjacent markets, but primarily around watches. And so it was a studio that's still around called White Brand Design. I learned a lot there with the team, and really appreciate the chance they gave me to get my hands into designing watches. My first project with them was for a very large Swiss brand,
Mhm.
looking at the evolution of a product line. So it's quite an interesting sort of in at the deep end
Right, right, yeah.
experience.
Cool. Um, so well, I was going to ask about starting watches from scratch, but since you just mentioned that, um, obviously working with a product that's already widely sold is quite different. So maybe talk about how the brand and the designer work together in that frame because they already have a watch. It's already in the market. So what are the discussion points like and how strict is the relationship? Just tell us a bit more about that.
So I think it's fair to say it varies brand by brand. Uh, some companies have a very strong identity that's been built not just over a few years, but in the watch industry over decades or many decades for many of the companies. And a lot of their products follow a very evolutionary process. So it's tweaks to sizes, proportions, detailing, more like a Porsche 911, if you look at sort of the car analogy,
Mhm.
rather than a radical reinvention each time. That project I mentioned was very much an evolution. It was an existing product line that needed to be made more contemporary in its sizing and its detailing. So that meant really sort of tightening up some of the edges, slightly sharper, slightly more contemporary than a sort of slightly softer 90s kind of aesthetic that it had. But then there's
Mhm.
other companies that say we have a product line and we want to completely reinvent it. And we want to look at what would happen if we take a watch that was designed in the 80s and replace that with a watch that's very much designed from today. New startups, of course, if we sort of link into the other question you were mindful of, are very different because they don't have that heritage to lean on. And so instead for them, it's about what does a product mean in relation to the brand they're wanting to build, and how
Mhm.
do you help them in pulling something out of thin air that represents them and will target the audience that they're looking to get in front of.
Yeah. But on the evolution side, why do the brands go to an external agency? Surely they have designers working for them already if they're a big brand.
Yeah, so I think that that's very much a trend that's happened over the past decade. I mean, I've been doing this for a little over a decade now. When I first started, there was a larger number of independent studios that a lot of the larger brands went to. But over the past decade, they have brought a lot more designers in-house.
Oh,
A
right.
number of people I used to work with now work in-house at some
Mhm.
of the larger brands. And so they have their own internal design teams, and that there is less work going externally. Typically, the smaller companies, the independent watchmaking scene, startups, it's those kinds of companies that go externally.
Oh, right. That surprises me. I would have thought it was a trend that was going the other way around.
It's very much seems to be, at least from my experience, has been a trend where the larger companies are bringing people in-house. and it's the smaller ones that perhaps don't have the cost base or the development cycle of justifying their own in-house design teams who go to the external studios and designers now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Have you ever been tempted to go in-house for a while?
Yeah, it's certainly been tempting. I think I really enjoy the diversity of so many different kinds of brands, and not just different kinds of
Yeah,
product, but I've had the pleasure of working on some very high-end independent watchmaking, but at the same time, some incredibly accessible startup brands who are making watches at a price point that you couldn't conceive of if you were looking at sort of high watchmaking. So
yeah,
I enjoy the diversity of that, and also the types of brands from very classical dress watches to quite contemporary, bold sports watches and everything in between.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. So I've never once thought that I should create a watch. It's just not something that interests me in terms of a passion project or a commercial project. But for the people who do want to do it, like, can you take us through how the process goes? So, when do you get involved, and when you do get involved, what's the steps to take it from whatever their passion and idea is to having something manufactured as a prototype?
Sure, it's a really interesting question. Thank you for that. So it opens up to many levels of what is a startup founder in the watch space, because you get some people who've been in the industry for a long time or have
Mm,
had many successes in
yeah,
business, and
yeah,
they're putting a lot of capital in, they're investing in a very big way, and so they already have their own team
right.
in-house
I
to do
see.
a whole range of things. They've got a business plan for the next 5 years. They have a very clear brief of what the first product needs to be, and it's not quite the same as an existing brand because there's still a lot of discovery to do, but
Hmm.
there's a very clear roadmap in place. Whereas quite often, I mean, to the example you gave there, if someone just wants to say, actually, I really want to start a watch brand, um, when they reach out to me, quite often the first thing I do is I put on a very pessimistic hat and put out all the challenges to doing that
Hmm.
because the barrier to entry is so high. It's a very
Yeah,
competitive industry. The amount of capital needed to get your first product off the ground is pretty huge, irrespective of what part of the market you're aiming at. And the time from kicking off a project to actually having watches with your customers can easily be a year or more.
yeah,
And so there's always a sort of a conversation around the realism of this is what it actually takes to get to the point of having watches with customers. And actually, before you've even got your watch to your customers, you're going to have to start developing at least watch two, potentially watch three, to
hmm,
ensure you have a pipeline of products coming out and you don't have these big peaks of a watch comes out and then you wait a year before something else happens. So once we've got past that stage, it does vary between different founders that I've worked with. For some, it's very much a case of helping them purely on the product side, helping them figure out what that first watch perhaps should be, looking at, okay, what is your design brief? What is your technical specification? Sometimes they have some very clear thoughts on that. Sometimes it's a little bit more fuzzy and needs a bit of work, and then diving into watch design. There's other brands where I actually step back and help them more on the product strategy and the brand strategy of, okay, well, you've come to me wanting a watch brand. What's the brand about? How are you differentiated from the
right.
hundreds of thousands of brands that are out there? And how are we going to navigate through that to come up with something that is unique in some way?
Okay. And do do you draw on paper? Do you sit down with their drawings? What have you done over time to actually start making it happen?
So until very recently, everything started with manual sketching on
Right.
paper. More recently, I've switched quite a bit of my sketching to an iPad purely
Hmm.
because I've been traveling a lot with client meetings, and not all clients are in the UK anymore. So it's a case of just having something easy to travel with. I still do quite a lot on paper. So between paper and iPad sketches, you get to a sort of the spark of an idea, and you see something, think actually, yeah, this is interesting. We want to pursue that further. That's where it tends to get more digital, developing more 2D renders. So it's lots of Photoshop, that kind of work,
Hmm.
getting to an overall view of what the case might be and indications of the dial, things like that. Then we start tightening that up using primarily sort of digital software, Photoshop, Illustrator, a few others, to get to a concept design of what the watch wants to be. And once we've got the concept design signed off, we then move into 3D,
Right.
start modeling the case of the watch, carry out 3D prints, see how it wears on the wrist, make adjustments, fine detailing, things like that, getting it ready to a final design that we can hand on to a manufacturer.
Hmm.
Manufacturers would then do some further sort of technical refinement that matches their production processes, because every manufacturer is slightly different depending on their supply chain as to how they're going to manufacture and engineer the watch. And then we get to prototypes, review those, iterate a few times, and hopefully at that point get ready to produce the marketing and materials and things that you need for launch.
Right. So when we see those famous sketches, of like someone like Gerald Genta, and then you have the sketches and then they turn into watches, but it always starts with quite a detailed, flat 2D image. That's still the way it's done
Yeah,
today.
it's still the way. I mean, there are some projects where potentially you might jump straight into 3D because it's led by the 3D form of the case or something like that. And so
Right.
you make little, almost like a maquette, if it was thinking of sculpture, and you'd mock things up and you get a sense of actually this is
Yeah.
roughly what we're going to do. And then you jump back to sketching. But it's very much still an interplay of sketching and the art side of it and the more technical digital solutions that we have now. Of course,
Hmm.
back in James's day, there was less of that. And so a lot of the work that he would do would be very much sketches, paintings, gouache, things like that,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
engineers then take on. And they're fantastic
Yeah.
drawings to see.
And famously in his case, he did thousands and thousands and thousands of these sketches, and many of them are still never to be seen in public. But also, he then did just hand them on, and
Yeah,
someone else had to go and work out how to do it. Which, if you look into the story of both the Nautilus bracelet and the Royal Oak bracelet, the technical challenges of those bracelets were very, very high at the time in the 1970s.
I can imagine. And I've loved seeing sort of drawings of his and drawings of other designers of that period, that are incredible drawings. And as you say, then take a lot of engineering to turn into reality. Uh, Part of the challenge that I found when I was starting out was that because watchmaking is such a technical industry, you have to design with an understanding of how to manufacture these things.
Yeah.
Because you can draw anything you want, but to actually be able to make it is the next challenge, and particularly for a certain cost, for it to not just become extraordinarily expensive.
So that's my next question is do you have to get into detailed discussions, or do you have like an engineering expert like network of some kind where you actually hand off to them and they'll negotiate with manufacturers? How does that side of it work as you go through the development process?
So it's very different with different clients. For
Right.
some established companies, they already have their supply chain, their manufacturers, and others. Some of those will have their own in-house technical teams.
Yeah.
So once we have a final design, I hand over to them. We have a back and forth of reviewing how their technical development aligns with my design intent, but it's quite hands off for me from there. Then the other extreme to that is very much where I'm very involved through the engineering, the technical feasibility. Sometimes it's myself, sometimes there's suppliers that assist me with some of that more technical, more engineering based work, getting to the point where it's ready for a manufacturer to take on. And
Hmm.
then there's an in between where there are a number of organizations in the industry who can take on that engineering sort of
Right.
technical feasibility work and production of prototypes, because they then take on the manufacturing for brands. So a lot of small companies that don't manufacture in-house but
Yeah.
have their own manufacturers, when they go to them, they have an engineering capability there that can assist to take my designs into something that's feasible.
But you've actually had to develop a fair bit of that expertise as well.
Yeah, yeah, through the years and through some of those projects where there is a bit more of an onus on me to help resolve some of these things and be able to clearly communicate to the engineers, this is how I want to manufacture this case construction. We're
Right.
actually trying to hit this level of water resistance with this movement and at this cost. So over the years, you pick things up.
Um, well, yeah, I'd like to come back to the issue of water resistance, but to move the conversation on a little bit in terms of themes, which part of the process do you enjoy the most?
I think I do. Well, I think there's two sides of the process that I enjoy the most, and I think it'd be hard to pick between them. I think I really enjoy the discovery phase of here's the new challenge,
Hmm.
here's the brief. We want to go out and create this, and of course, it's then my task to come up with various different designs and directions in which we could take. But I always really enjoy finding a direction that stretches the client a little bit more than perhaps they're first expecting.
Right.
just test the water of, well, what if we take the spark of what you're thinking there and pull it a little bit further, see what we could do. I really enjoy that. And then at the other end, when you finally see a prototype actually ready to wear and put on the wrist that looks and feels like the real watch, and you can compare that to the initial direction of the drawings, and you can actually hold something that
Mm.
you've created. That's always a very fulfilling feeling.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, that's bringing things to life, literally, and
Absolutely.
in terms of that. So I'll pause there and see if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask. So if you do, please unmute yourself and speak up, if or put it in the chat if you're not able to speak right now. Otherwise, I can ask another question.
Hi Max, thanks a lot for the talk so far. I was wondering what's one of your favorite watches that you've designed?
Hi, Sam. Thank you very much for that. Difficult question, particularly just because I work for such a diverse range of clients, and it would be hard to pick sort of a favorite child as such
Okay,
between all of them. But I would say I've had the pleasure recently of working with a number of younger companies and startups, and that's been really interesting because for a long time it's been relatively established companies I've been working with. And so recently there was a Dutch startup called VPC.
okay,
We created everything from scratch, but quite publicly.
yeah,
So a series on Fratello talking about the process. That was a really interesting experience to do the whole thing on show
yeah,
to the world rather than waiting to the end. But then there's been a watch with William Wood that was a charitable project. And so some of the funds that are being raised from that watch are going towards the renovation of a boat that rescued soldiers in Dunkirk. And so
oh
there's a
cool,
lovely story behind what we chose to do with the watch there. And then I assisted a friend recently, Matteo, who I used to work with back at a Collected Man. He's launching a brand, and I helped him as the creative director of his new company in figuring out the case design for his very sculptural watch. So there's been some really interesting projects, and every one is very different, which has been
yeah.
very enjoyable.
Is that the one that's just been launched? I can't remember its name.
Yes, Anoma, his brand.
Anoma.
Yeah, Anoma, Anoma, inspired by a vintage table that he found an architect.
Yeah, this
And
one's really interesting. I'll just share the screen so everyone can see it because this only came out a couple of days ago and is a very, very unusual watch, even by the standards of some of the watches you've designed. Because yeah, maybe you could if you can
Oh
put a
wow.
thumbs up so you can see it. You can see that, right?
Oh, I think
yeah.
I might have seen
So,
that on Instagram actually. I think
so there's
they're
a
putting up lots of pictures of vintage Cartier. I think maybe it's a different brand.
so there's a reason we don't have many triangular watches. Um, because people worry that they're hard to wear. So talk us through this case then, Max, and how you're involved. I mean, if you weren't the lead designer, then please speak up. But just talk us through how you went about this because it's a really really unusual watch.
Yeah, of course. And this one, as I say, was very much it was led by a very clear existing concept that the brand had. The brand had a vision for this watch. The dial was designed fully in-house. To make that very clear, the dial is not my work. My work here was around the case and turning the vision that Matteo had for this case into something that was well resolved, manufacturable, commercially sized, able to fit a mechanical movement in there, the strap, everything else. And so it was a design challenge, but also a technical challenge of how to pull this together for, as you say, a very distinctive shape that is quite unlike pretty much every other watch I've ever worked on as far as its form.
How does that crystal go in? Is there a gasket there, or was he using resin?
I can't remember off the top of my head. I'd have to go
Oh,
check.
okay.
Sorry.
Uh,
Great first technical question.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean,
I
that's the first thing I think when I see a case shaped like that.
The crystal is completely flat. Um, we managed to get it so that the case becomes completely flat for the crystal, so there's no distortion in the crystal above the dial.
and how long did it take you to work out the right angle to put the triangular case versus the strap? Were there a lot of different options there?
There was a lot of iteration. This
Yeah.
project, as I say, because it was from an existing concept, it was a very iterative process of coming up with the overall design of how could you pull together all of these different elements in a way that works, as far as having the strap that runs through with completely standard straps,
Mm.
having a mechanical movement in there, getting some water resistance, looking at the case construction, and then lots of iteration as far as the overall proportions of the different triangles, the radiuses of the curves, trying to get that pebble shape, not having these big straight edges anywhere, and then being able to manufacture that for what I feel is a very fair retail price for such a unique watch.
Hmm.
Was the water resistance quite hard to get?
It was it was okay once we figured out the case construction. The challenge was figuring out the case construction, where
Okay.
the gaskets need to be, making sure you have enough material. But once you've done that, modern gaskets are pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool.
I'm just going to share
That's a really
um,
cool watch.
this VPC one because this is much more traditional. Just trying to find the right image and then I'll share it. So how were you involved with this VPC brand?
So VPC, I've been involved with VPC since near the beginning. Uh, Thomas Van Straten, who's a writer at Fratello,
Hmm.
set out with a vision to create a go anywhere, do anything watch that
Okay.
doesn't look like an overtly sporting watch. He's had a lot of experience with vintage watches over the
Yeah.
years, and I've obviously seen a lot of watches through Fratello too. And really, this is a watch led by a purist view of a manual wind movement, small sub-seconds at 6, having lots of loom, having a really robust case. So the whole case and bracelet is hardened, having slightly more vintage sizing. It's a 37-ish millimeter case. Lots of other things and details in there, but it's really around the details on this watch and the finishing.
Hmm.
And so what we wanted to do was to create a new design for a very classically sort of positioned watch with a couple of subtle details that really make it stand out. So particularly the chamfer on the lower edge of the case that turns it into a sort of semi-hooded lug construction.
Sorry, so that is I don't can you see my pointer there?
Yeah, you might need to, if you go onto one of the product pages, there's probably some close-ups um, of that.
It's
Yeah,
really
that
nice.
that curved polished
So
chamfer.
that's you're talking about that
Ah,
so for those who don't know, a chamfer is a way you edge uh, basically take away a corner is
Break an edge.
the simplest way of talking about it, and there's a lot of different ways to do it. And this is called chamfering, isn't it, where it's a straight cut.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what we've done there is have a mixture of polished and brushed surfaces, lots of very complex curving surfaces that all come together in a watch that actually is quite small but has quite a lot of presence on the wrist. But we've also pushed a lot of limits in sort of the case construction there too. We've got a double dome sapphire, and we've pushed the handset up into where the glass is to reduce the overall thickness of the watch. And we've reduced the height of the hand stack so the hands are closer together than they would typically be in a lot of modern watches, various other things. And are continuing to make iterations to that watch before it gets to customers a little bit later this year. So the pre-order's been ongoing, and the production run, I think it should be delivered to people around November.
It's a very smart looking watch, and I think to your point, as someone who now also spends a lot of time seeing a lot of different watches and has a passion for vintage, it fascinates me that this is one of those watches that the more you look at, the more you'll see the influences, which isn't true of a lot of modern sports style watches like this. They're a bit more straightforward, whereas this style of hands is basically mid 20th century handset updated because the loom design on these hands is nothing like what you'd have found in the mid 20th century because there wasn't any loom on hands until a bit later on, and when they did, it was a bit haphazard. So this is an update, but that design, I'm a Jaeger LeCoultre. collector, JLC collector, so I've got quite a few watches with this handset, but from the 1950s. So I like that a lot, and I hadn't heard of it. So thank you for bringing it up.
And then thank you for your kind compliments of the watch. It's very much a watch that the details were the most important thing, and it's for a part of the collector community that is
Very nice.
interested in these kinds of things. And manual wind is not for everyone. It probably would have been more commercial to go with an automatic movement, but it would have taken away from the overall vision for that particular watch and for what the company was about. And we've worked hard for it to be a watch where actually the more you wear it, the more you enjoy it. And we've seen that with a couple of the prototypes that have gone to people to experience. They've actually found having it on the wrist, it's been the most interesting experience because, as you say, Hamish, the more you wear it, the more you look at it, the more of the details you sort of find and the Easter eggs and things that we've hidden around the watch.
Yeah. No, it's certainly an exciting project. So I'll just load up the William Wood page now because it's going to show you both at the same time, the Dunkirk and the fire exit.
Sure.
And I know that, well, again, personally, I don't mind saying this. I think both of these watches are absolutely extraordinary in terms of their design. So I think you've done an incredible job, to be honest. Now, I've seen the green one, the fire exit in the metal, and I haven't seen the Dunkirk because it's only a few weeks on the market. But this is a company, for those who don't know William Wood, everything they do is fire service or fire and rescue service themed. And they've done an amazing job based up in the northeast of England. And I don't know how long you've worked with them, Max. I don't know how many watches you've worked on with them. But maybe you could tell me what you were telling me just before you started, a bit about the Dunkirk, and then we'll come back to the fire exit.
Yeah, of course.
Let's
Happy to do that. And I've known Johnny, the founder of William Wood, for quite a few years now. Met him at a watch event. I can't remember when, but several years ago. We've worked together across these two watches, are the first two watches that we've worked on together, the fire exit and then the Dunkirk. And the Dunkirk is actually inspired by and a charitable project that is generating proceeds towards the Massey Shore, which is a London fireboat that went to Dunkirk and rescued soldiers in the evacuation there, but also has a fantastic story of various other amazing things that it's done over the years, from putting out dock fires to rescuing all these soldiers and a number of other things afterwards too. I believe that there was meetings around the foundation of the NHS were held on the Massey Shore, if I remember correctly, and so fantastic mix of things. And what we wanted to do was create a watch that was inspired by the boat, that the trust that looks after the boat would be excited by, and was also leaning into this world of firefighting that, of course, is so strong to William Wood as a brand. And so when we were there on the boat for our design meeting, I was looking around, looking at the engine room. There's these great big pipes that the water was pumped through when it was putting out dock fires that we took inspiration from for the case sides, and these sort of big curving red pipes that you see on the watch. Then looking obviously bronze from a naval material, playing around with our own interpretation of an engine order telegraph, the thing you send instructions to the engine room from the wheelhouse for the dial, and just creating a watch that's really playful, very fun, and very much in keeping with William Wood's brand and aesthetic of a very powerful watch that you can definitely notice. It's not a shy and retiring dress watch, but it's very much not intended to be. It's really meant to be something that champions the history of that boat and firefighting.
So I'm sure there'll be a couple of other questions from others, but the question I want answered is about this case design.
Yes.
So what is going on with the red bits, as well as this obviously perfectly circular bronze case? I understand that, but can you talk me through the rest of it? Because I haven't had the chance to see it in the metal, so I can't really understand what's going on.
Yeah, so what we've got, there's it's a multi-piece construction watch. There's the bronze central case where
Yeah.
the movement of the dial, and then we've got the pipes as such, and inspired by that engine compartment on the ship, which really just generates a very big, bold aesthetic for the watch. We've got a black back where the brand has got some artwork in there that commemorates the history of Dunkirk and the evacuation with a piece of the Massey Shore, so the part of the original engine that is currently being restored, has been melted down into a piece of the boat. So the boat you
Right.
see back there is made from a piece of
What about
the
there?
yeah, so that's made from a piece of the original
Wow.
ship's engine. And it's obviously made fully waterproof with
So are these red bits brass as well?
so they're not brass, I believe they're steel, I'd have to double check. And then it's a very durable sort of matte finish paint, because what we wanted to do was copy as closely as we could the aesthetic of the pipes that are in the ship. And
Yeah,
if
I mean it's
I dig through my
extraordinary.
phone, I'd find effectively the same pipes in much larger scale.
Yeah, I mean I saw that immediately when I saw the watch, but then I guess I've been on enough boats to recognize it.
Mm.
Um, I have more questions on this watch, but I'll pause to let anyone else ask one.
Um, Hi, hi, Max. So my name is Anil. I'm obviously a member of the Watch Collectors Club. Recently joined, and yeah, you know what? It was just by chance. I think it was Oracle at the time we were talking about micro brands to watch out for, or boutique watches to look out for, and the Noma was there, and it really is a striking watch. When I saw it, I thought, wow, just an incredible shape, and it was great to hear about what you did to come up with that design. But I was interested as a designer, in the last couple of years, there's been some incredible designs, very unique, very vivid. Is there maybe from the last, yeah, maybe a couple of years, what's been a design that's caught your eye, and why?
You put me on the spot, and thank you for the question. I think that there has been quite a lot over recent years. That's interesting. I'm drawing a blank, being put on the spot. Maybe come back to me, and I will come up with something.
No worries, no worries.
Well,
Thank you.
what about the all-time classics of the very famous icons of the watch world? Which of those are more to taste in your favorites for whatever reason?
Um, yeah, so I've always been drawn towards quite small size watches. I mean, the first watch I ever received was from my grandfather. It was a 1947 era watch that he bought new when he was, I don't know, he was very young, and he'd always had. And so I was always drawn towards quite small vintage chronographs. That was my thing for a long while. And then as my sort of interest in design grew, I obviously became familiar with Omega Speedmaster and various other sort of mainstream, very iconic watches. IWC2. For a long time, IWC had my attention with some of the aqua timers, particularly some of the very early aqua timers with that really
Mm.
distinctive, very robust case shape, and the original, the deep one, I believe it is, with the depth sensor on it. So there was a couple of things there that got my attention. And then in more recent years, I've been very interested in what the independent watchmakers are doing. So brands like MB&F, Work, and others, very sculptural, and yes, from a taste perspective, not perhaps for everyone, but really fascinating as to what they can pack into a very small area that's so distinctive and so unique to them. So inspiration has varied and across various different bits of the watch spectrum over the years, and I'm sure it will continue to change and evolve over time.
Is it tricky to draw inspiration from things probably not so relevant to the firefighters watch just there? That's clearly very unique. But is it difficult to draw inspiration from things and use elements that work without feeling like you're copying something? Is that quite a tricky thing to navigate?
I think it's one of the hardest things. There was a number of brands I used to work for in Switzerland, um, mainly through the studio when I was first starting out, who quite often had watches that had themes to them or had various different, very particular sets of inspiration. And the challenge there was always to avoid being gimmicky, because it
Yeah,
was too
yeah.
easy just to have a watch with a very literal interpretation of something on the dial or whatever it might be, or on the case back. And I've always tried to avoid that. As time has gone on, people always come with a very clear set of inspiration of we really like this kind of architecture or we really like these
Okay.
cars or whatever it might be. And yes, it is a real challenge not to just make something into a gimmick or take a literal copy of, oh, we like this, let's apply this to the watch or
Hmm.
whatever it be. It's trying to find the spirit of what something is about and embed that into the product. There's a brand I'm working with in Australia at the moment who hasn't launched yet, but will be launching in the coming months. And we've got a watch there that really takes inspiration from the rugged sort of landscape of Australia and
Right.
all the kind of extreme sports that you'd be doing there, whether it's dirt biking or snowboarding, surfing, all of these kinds of things. And what we've tried to do there is not take anything literal and certainly not any sort of cliched sort of stereotypes of Australia, but to create something that really is of that landscape and of those kinds of activities and looks like the kind of product that you'd get if you were going out dirt biking or if you were
Okay.
going snowboarding that day. So trying to find something that exists in that world rather than copies from it.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine that being really tricky. Yeah. Yeah. Especially from I'm normally day jobs as an engineer, so I would someone with my brain would really struggle to do something like really capture the essence of something like that. It's all quite abstract and that sort of stuff. So okay, that's really cool.
And you're kind of, I mean, when I see some of these watches you've done, like the William Wood and the a triangular watch, you know, I don't think it's wrong to describe you as quite a brave designer. And you said earlier that you really like to push the clients. So, how have you found? Can you talk a bit about those discussions, really? The if you had it to where you've put something on the table and they've gone, bloody hell, we, we weren't quite thinking of that. Or are you actually, able to take people on that journey to go somewhere quite far? I mean,
So yes, I certainly have had that experience, but actually I've quite often been surprised.
mhm.
So quite often when we're in a project, particularly when we're quite early, I'll look at various options of how we might interpret the brief, where we might go, and put a number of them out there. Sometimes we'll lay them out in a particular way to tell a story of something that's the most traditional to the most avant-garde or whatever it might be, expecting someone to pick something in the middle or towards the more classical. And actually the client goes, this is really interesting. It's maybe a bit too far, but we like bits of this and let's bring this into the watch in some way. Sometimes they go, that's really not for us, and that's fine too. But I find it's useful to sort of pull on the edges in either direction. If someone's asking for something really contemporary, the other way can be to actually, what if we pared this back a bit and it's a little bit more
Right.
classical? And the idea is to just sort of find out not just what they think they have in their head at that time, but actually what is it that really excites them about a product or about what they want to be producing, and to then sort of navigate there. We certainly had that with the VPC project. Thomas had quite a clear idea of what he wanted for the watch, and I think has spoken quite publicly about it in the article series, where he said that what we did was we pulled on all these different bits and just slightly shifted it, and very much went on a journey together quite publicly with the series that was there, from where Thomas was at the beginning to something at the end that is still a very classically styled watch, but just pulling on a few of those threads, as you said earlier, Hamish, with some of the way in which we did the loom, a couple of the details in the case profile, things like that, that are that bit more contemporary than perhaps Thomas first thought he would be doing. And we very much went on that journey together. And that's part of my role as a designer, to guide people through and to get to what they want rather than what they think they want at the beginning or what they say they want.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that's. I guess that's the ideal, isn't it? If you're the person with the idea, you want help fully realizing it. And very few people would expect to be able to do it themselves. I'm just going to bring up the uh, Dunkirk watch again because I have a very particular question about a question that is illustrated by this watch. Um, So hopefully you can all see it again, and you can see the luminous parts of this watch. So what is quite remarkable for those who know anything about watches is how finely detailed this lume is. And it's my understanding that this has actually only become technically possible quite recently. So with the development of new forms of luminous material, basically, and the ability to shape them and put them. And what you'll note is the hands are entirely luminous, even though if you look at the unloomed picture, they look like bronze, so they match the rest of the watch. So can you talk a bit about that and being able to use it in this way? And then also talk about how you think about using new technologies, how you learn about them, how they travel through the watch world. Obviously, working with brands, young brands like William Wood, is a help, maybe not. But can you just sort of talk about this bit of this watch first, and then broaden it into new technologies that are coming into watchmaking, and help us understand how you think about them?
Yeah, of course. So with this watch, from the start, we thought it would be very important that it should have a lot of lume, and it should be just as distinctive at night as it is in the day, in part because the engine order telegraphs, which that dial sort of takes sort of gentle inspiration from. It's certainly not a copy of any real engine order telegraph that's out there, because it has to work with sort of 12 segments and things like that. But very much we wanted to light up the watch at night and create something distinctive. I was aware, and obviously have seen several times in recent years, the things you can do with lume now, in the way you mix luminous paints, the way you apply them, the way that they can be applied in a more consistent finish for things like hands and larger surface areas too. I'm sure you've seen the trend of lots of watches which have got full lume dials and things like that. And so we put the request out there, and obviously then waited for the manufacturer to get back to us on what they could do. And as you can see there, they've achieved the overall aim. And I'm looking forward to seeing the final production piece in the metal, and getting a chance to see the strength of that lume that they managed to achieve on those hands.
Yeah, no, it looks really, really smart, and it's just having such small letters, especially at that 11 o'clock position, which I says finished with engine. You know, to have them look good, must have probably took them a little bit of tinkering and playing around, but I'm looking forward to seeing it as well.
Those hands look really impressive. To go from bronze during the daylight to that is awesome.
I haven't actually seen the final hands in the metal yet, because the watch has gone to the brand, and the founder of the brand has been traveling. It's gone to the photographer, so I haven't actually seen the final hands yet. So I'm looking forward to
Really
seeing.
excited, yeah. It's really cool design.
I found an excellent article about Superluminova, which is one of the most common types of luminous material used at the moment. It's actually a ceramic, and the article talks about how they make it and then process it into a usable substance. I'll put it in the replay notes, but it's very, very, and I'll send it to you guys. It's very, very interesting because it explains how you can now paint anything over the top, and then when it's luminous, the color comes out that you intended, which is radically different to all of the previous versions of lume we've used in watchmaking. So it's very exciting. And maybe if you want to address the talk about my question about technology in general.
Yeah, sure. Happy to jump back to that. So I think there's a range of things, from keeping an eye on various sort of supplier media and marketing that you get through, and reading articles much like the one you just mentioned, of keeping on track. There's a case of asking for things that you're not quite sure if it exists, and then finding out we can't do that, but we can do this, this, and this. And quite often you find out things that you never knew were possible. The third one is going to the sort of the industry trade fairs and meeting suppliers of all sorts of unbelievable things. I'm not able to get to EPHA this year, but every year in Switzerland there's a very large event for suppliers to the industry, and lots of people that do manufacturing and producing components and parts and materials, things like that. So that's always very interesting. And then the final one is visiting manufacturers and suppliers. When you go and visit people, whether they're doing enameling or lume or dial manufacturing, whatever it might be, when you meet the people that are working there, you quite often discover all sorts of things that would be possible if people asked to do it, and
Right.
people quite often don't ask to do it
Yeah.
because they don't exist. And then there's other times where you know something should be possible, and so you set out to do it, and then it takes several weeks or months or however long of iteration to get there to be able to manufacture something, whether it's a particular dial pattern or texture or it's a material finish. There's usually a way. It just takes time.
hmm hmm I'm sure. Yeah. I mean, it's from my perspective, we're seeing a real flourishing in innovation now in terms of what people are trying, the increased use of color, the continued innovation in case materials. We're now seeing a lot more case shape innovation. Like just this month, we've seen quite three different watches, including the one we were talking about earlier, that have radically different cases. And heaven knows if that's going to start a 1970s style bonanza. I doubt it somewhat, because the 70s, when it comes to case design, was completely mad in a lot of ways. And if people don't know what I'm talking about, just start looking for Omega watches from the 1970s, and you'll soon come across lots of very, very unusual things. But I wanted to ask you now, are there any types of watch that you haven't yet had a chance to design that you'd like to consider for a project?
So that's interesting one. So I think that it's not something I haven't had a chance to design, but I design a lot less of, and it's ladies' watches
Uh-huh.
and jewelry watches.
And
And
jewelry, did you say?
yeah, and sorry, watches that are gem set
Yeah.
and sort of more artistic, one-off, those kinds of things. And in part because primarily the mass section of the industry are men's watches to varying degrees. Um, there's a fewer sort of women's watches out there. Often they tend to be resized men's watches with some color changes and things like that, which I find to be a real shame. I think there's a lot more opportunity there than the industry is perhaps capturing right now. Perhaps it's down to demand, and if so, then maybe we're stuck in that way for a while yet. But they're actually very enjoyable to do these very creative, artistic things, and I don't get as many projects to do that. And it would be a pleasure to do a few more of them.
Yeah, I was going to ask about jewelry watches because we've been lucky enough with the Watch Collectors Club to have events with various of the big brands famous for their jewelry watches like Piaget, Bulgari, Van Cleef more recently.
Mm,
Um, and they're just absolutely extraordinary creations. They're technically incredible in some cases, both horologically and in terms of the gem setting and the design of the frameworks that the gems sit in, and
absolutely.
still become a wearable piece and a usable watch. Um, but I guess, and the brands certainly make out that a lot of that is done in-house using long honed expertise.
Yeah, certainly. For the gem set and the artistic watches, I think realistically the chance of me working one of those is going to be quite small because so much of it is done in-house and with jewelers and with people who have spent decades specializing in that particular area of watchmaking and of jewelry. But I've had the chance to support and work on a couple of those projects over the years in different ways, and they're great fun. So it'd be a pleasure to do a few more of them.
Yeah, yeah. It brings me great pleasure to organize these events for members of the club because while our members and our myself, we're not necessarily owners, purchasers, or ever going to, really spend time with these watches in our collection. They're absolutely extraordinary to look at. So I always encourage people to do that if you get the chance, to handle these pieces and just take stock of how much work's gone into creating them and making them look like whatever creation they're mimicking. Whether it's flowers or they're abstract or they're the serpenti snakes from Bulgari. They're just such extraordinary timepieces in their own right.
And they certainly are.
So yeah, I guess as we come to an end, you're sort of very much in the middle of your career, and we've already asked you to name some favorites. But is there anything in your collection that you own, for design reasons?
So actually, not right now, and solely because I'm in between. I'm buying a house, so
Oh,
the watches have had to slow down a little bit.
yeah.
Uh, but I certainly look to get a few more in the sort of months and years ahead. But right now, the house is unfortunately the focus.
Yeah, it happens a lot. But is there a timepiece that you've always wanted? I mean, personally, like I always wanted a Reverso because of that extremely famous design. And I do have one in my collection. Is there something that stands out to you of past or present?
Well, I think I've always been drawn to the Cartier Crash,
Yeah.
and particularly the early ones. And so I think if there was a watch which I'm looking to get hold of in time, it would likely be a Crash of some kind. There's a few other sort of vintage platinum Cartiers that I really love. So I think that's sort of from a personal point of view, the sort of aesthetic and interest that I've always sort of been quite drawn to. And there's a few very interesting watches out there to look out for.
Yeah, I mean they have an absolutely staggering 100 years of watch design. I always, one day we'll be able to do events with Cartier. I have had discussions with them, but it hasn't come about yet. But part of me thinks I should just do a online series of talks about Cartier because there's so much to talk about and there's such an incredible history of, well, it's 110 years now. 1914 was the first men's wristwatch with the Cartier Santos Dumos. And since then, they've just come up with a staggering array of very, very well designed watches. And a few horological innovations alongside it, but mostly astonishing design, inspiration, and execution. So yeah, watch this space. Maybe we'll do some later in the year. Just talk about Cartier for an hour, and you can join us.
Sure.
So yeah, unless anyone else has any more questions.
I've just got one. Do you have any book recommendations? So for someone who's a complete novice, try and understand the fundamentals of design and all that sort of stuff. Do you have any books that you'd recommend?
But
Maybe with a slight steer towards watches, obviously.
fundamentals of design. Very happy to get hold of your details from Hamish, and I will have a proper think. But as far as books recently that I've found very sort of inspiring from a design point of view, is there's a book of Grima jewelry with incredible sculptural and just artistic pieces of jewelry and a series of watches for Amiga from, I think it was, I can't remember the exact year. And it really quite amazing designs in there, very radical, very naturalistic, and very different to a lot of the other things that are out there. And I found that a really interesting and useful sort of source of inspiration for me recently. I've also got several books that are
Can you say that name again?
Yeah, so it was Grima.
Grima, Grima.
Oh, I'm not familiar with that. I'll check it out.
Grima jewelry, yeah. Some very beautiful pieces.
Awesome, thanks.
That's all right.
That's a great question. And if you did happen to share any thoughts you might have, Max, that would be great.
Yeah,
I can put them in
certainly have a think for that.
On the website as well. For anyone looking just for more design inspiration on our resources page, which it's got lots of stuff, but obviously it's 100% about watches currently. So we'll finish there. Thank you very, very much, Max. That was an extraordinary, very insightful, and I really enjoyed that. Design is really important to me. That's one of the reasons I love watches so much. I'm not a technical guy. I'm not a serial number guy. I'm kind of a design, brand, history guy. So really appreciate that insight. And clearly you're doing well and have got lots on your plate. So I wish you all the best with the subsequent projects and hope to see more of your watches in future.
That's very kind of you. Thank you very much for having me. And yeah, watch this space. Lots of interesting things to come.
Great. Thank you very much.